There is a moment in life of certain brands when the story changes, but the audience keeps reading the old chapter. Not because the audience is naive, not because they are blind, it's because brands don't announce these transitions. They don't issue press releases saying we have changed roads. The shift happens gradually, wrapped in consistency, protected by reputation, softened by years of trust. The brand still looks familiar. It still sounds familiar. It still performs. From the outside, everything seems stable. But inside, the function has changed. I have been thinking about this a lot recently, partly because the same pattern keeps appearing across industries that, on the surface, should behave very differently. Furniture, fashion, technology, even entertainment. Brands that were born out of disruption eventually becomes guardians of their own legacy. What once pushed culture forward slowly turns into something that preserves it. What once challenged norms becomes a source of reassurance. When that happens, the brand stops competing on innovation in the cultural sense. It starts competing on heritage, on trust, comfort, on status. That's the lens I want to use here because it frames a question that has been increasingly difficult to ignore. Is Apple becoming the new Vitra? Not as nostalgia, not as a provocation for its own sake, but as a way of understanding what happens when a brand becomes so successful that it no longer needs to win the future, it only needs to protect the present. Innovation is one of those words that has been stretched so thin that it has lost its edges. Every update is called innovation, every performance gain is framed as breakthrough. Every annual refresh is marketed as a revolution. But that's not innovation, that's iteration. Iteration is refinement, it's improvement within an existing model. It can be technically impressive, commercially smart, even necessary, but it doesn't change behavior. It doesn't rewrite expectations, it doesn't create a before and after. Innovation does. Innovation is what happens when a product forces people to relate to technology differently, when it changes habits, when it alters culture, not just performance metrics. Apple's own history is the clearest way to define this because Apple used to do that exactly. Early Apple computers didn't just compete on specs, they proposed a different relationship between humans and machines. The iPod didn't simply store music, it turned music into something portable, personal, and identity driven. Your library became a reflection of who you were, not just what you owned. Then the iPhone arrived and did something that in hindsight feels obvious, but at the time it was radical. It removed the physical keyboard and committed fully to the screen. That single decision reshaped an entire industry. It didn't improve phones, it defined what a phone was going to be for the next 2 decades. That's innovation. It doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't hide, it creates new norms. So when people say Apple still innovates because the chip is faster or because the camera is better, I understand the point, but I don't accept the definition. Faster is not innovation, more efficient is not innovation, better battery life is not innovation. Those things matter, but they belong to a different category. Vitra is a powerful reference point because it embodies a transition many people sense intuitively, even if they have never articulated it. Historically, Vitra was deeply tied to modern design innovation. Its collaborations and products were once forward-looking, sometimes controversial, often challenging established ideas of what furniture should be. When those designs first appeared, they weren't timeless, they were new. They carried risk, they belonged to a future that hadn't yet arrived. Over time, something shifted, not necessarily in how the objects were made, but in what they became to represent. Today, Vitra is widely perceived as the guardian of timeless design. Its identity is dominated by icons, recognizable silhouettes, and cultural permanence. Even when the brand works with contemporary designers, the public doesn't look to Vitra for experimentation. They look to it for sanctity. What's fascinating is how the products function socially. For someone deeply embedded in design culture, owning a Vitra piece can be a deliberate, informed choice rooted in an understanding of history, production quality, and design lineage. But for a much broader audience, Vitra operates differently. It becomes a credential, a signal, a shortcut. You buy the chair not only because it's well made, but because everyone recognizes it. That recognition reflects back on you. It signals taste, education, belonging, even if you can't truly articulate why. That's cultural capital in object form. Vitra becomes less about innovation and more about status through design. This isn't a failure, it's a transformation, but it comes with a cost. Once a brand becomes a guardian of icons, it becomes difficult for it to feel genuinely new again. It becomes fixed in the public imagination as the brand of classics. It might still produce new work, but people don't look to it for the next thing. They look to it for the safe thing. And that's where the parallel with Apple becomes interesting. There is a point where innovation stops being the engine of a brand, not because the brand has failed, but because innovation is no longer what the market asks from it. At the same stage, the brand's role changes. What once existed to challenge conventions begins to exist to protect a certain way of doing things. The priority is no longer to redefine expectations, but to preserve coherence. The value proposition shifts from possibility to reassurance. This isn't a stagnation, it's consolidation. Brands that reach this stage are rewarded for consistency, for continuity, for being dependable in a world that feels increasingly volatile. Innovation, when it happens, is expected to be invisible, absorbed seamlessly into what already exists. Comfort becomes the product, and comfort, when executed well, is of an amazing value. This is the lens through which Apple's evolution starts to make sense. Apple's past innovations were never about novelty for the novelty's sake. They were about aligning cutting-edge technology with refined design to create radically better user experiences. Innovation was not loud, but it was unmistakable. Over time, that clarity has given way to continuity. Look at the iPhone today. Year after year, the most visible changes are found in details like camera lenses, materials, and finishes. The improvements are real, the quality is exceptional, but the experience is familiar. Nothing asks the user to rethink how the device fits into their life. That familiarity is not accidental, it's the product. Apple's devices are now expensive, polished, and reassuring. They sit comfortably in a luxury territory where design signals taste and reliability signals professionalism. Owning an Apple product no longer says, "This is new," it says, "This is the right choice." That's the language of heritage. This transition is not unique to Apple. It has happened before in fields where innovation once defined the very identity of a brand. Brown is a clear example. For decades, it shaped industrial design through clarity, restraint, and functional intelligence. Its products didn't just look different, they changed how everyday objects were understood. Over time, those principles became a reference rather than a frontier. Brown didn't fail, it didn't disappear, it became design history, respected, cited, admired, but no longer expected to define what comes next. Chanel followed a different trajectory, but the underlying mechanism is similar. What began as radical innovation eventually transformed into the careful preservation of codes, language, silhouettes, materials became sacred. Creativity shifted from invention to a stewardship. In fashion, this can be an extraordinarily powerful position. Heritage is the product. But technology operates on a different timeline. When a technology brand becomes heritage, it risks losing something fashion and furniture can afford to keep. That's permission to define the future. In technology, relevance is not sustained by memory, it's sustained by momentum. This shift didn't happen in isolation. Apple's audience evolved alongside the brand. The people who once chose Apple because it challenged conventions are now in a different phase of life. They are no longer building identity through experimentation, they are protecting work, routines, businesses, families. What they value now is not disruption, but reliability, not surprise, but continuity. Apple's positioning reflects this with remarkable precision. It no longer needs to convince its audience to change behavior, it needs to make sure nothing breaks. The design language reinforces familiarity, the ecosystem reinforces dependency, the pricing reinforces status. This isn't about age as a number, it's about life stage, responsibility, and expectation. Apple has aligned itself perfectly with that reality. In doing so, it has become a brand that people settle into rather than one that they discover. And that is both its strength and its constraint. Apple still innovates, there is no denying on that. Its advances in performance, optimization, manufacturing, quality, and ecosystem integration are remarkable. But most of this innovation happens beneath the surface. It doesn't alter behavior, it doesn't reshape expectations, it reinforces the sense that everything is under control. This is why innovation elsewhere can feel more exciting, even when it's less refined. When innovation is visible, when it can be seen and felt, it enters culture. When it remains hidden, it becomes part of trust. Apple has chosen trust, and once that becomes the primary narrative, it can be difficult to distinguish it from inertia. But business innovation isn't cultural leadership, and this is where the conversation needs to become more nuanced. Apple has not stopped innovating at a business level. On the contrary, it has executed one of the most impressive strategic shifts in modern corporate history. The expansion into services like Apple TV, App Store, iCloud, Apple Pay, and wearables represent real innovation. These moves have transformed Apple from a hardware-first company into a diversified ecosystem with recurring high-margin revenue streams. This is business innovation at its best. It's also why Apple has remained at the top of the market capitalization for so long, driven by profitability, brand loyalty, ecosystem lock-in, and financial discipline. Few companies in history have managed this transition so effectively. But business innovation and cultural innovation are not the same thing. One protects revenue, the other protects relevance. This distinction becomes clearer when we look at what's happening elsewhere in the market. Nvidia surpassing Apple in market capitalization, even temporarily, is not just a financial headline, it's a symbolic shift. For over a decade, Apple represented the pinnacle of technological leadership. Now, Nvidia occupies that space in the collective imagination. Why? Because Nvidia is visibly shaping the next paradigm. AI, gaming, simulation, computing, at scale, Nvidia isn't just refining existing categories, it's enabling entirely new ones. Its technology doesn't just perform better, it changes what's possible. That's cultural innovation. Nvidia feels like the future in the way Apple once did. We have seen this before. Sony once dominated consumer electronics and culture. It missed the digital ecosystem shift, failed to build a coherent software and services platform, and lost ground in areas it once defined. It didn't collapse overnight, it slowly faded from leadership. Apple is in a far stronger position than Sony ever was. Its ecosystem is robust, its finances are extraordinary, its brand is deeply embedded. But strength can also create blind spots. The risk is not collapse, the risk is irrelevance at the frontier. Apple today occupies a powerful position. As a heritage luxury device brand, it sells comfort, reliability, and status. That is immensely valuable, especially to an audience that has grown with the brand and now prioritizes stability over disruption. But heritage is a double-edged sword. Once a brand becomes a symbol of established taste, it becomes less attractive to those who are still forming theirs. Once innovation becomes invisible, the future narrative moves elsewhere, especially when younger generations are looking not for reassurance, but for meaning, experimentation, and possibility. The danger is not that Apple fails to make money. The danger is that it stops shaping what comes next. In technology, that's a dangerous place to be, because the brands that define the future are rarely the ones most invested in protecting the present. When innovation turns into heritage, it doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as maturity, refinement, and success. The products still work beautifully, the experience is still polished, the brand still feels relevant. But the question has changed. The brand is no longer asking what the future should look like. It is asking how to maintain what already exists. Apple hasn't stopped being excellent, but excellence alone doesn't guarantee relevance in the next paradigm. Heritage is powerful, comfort is seductive, but if innovation becomes something to preserve rather than pursue, the future quietly moves elsewhere, and that's the real risk.